It's really a tremendous pleasure to introduce our presenters tonight, Dean Howarth and Jennifer Horowitz. Dean teaches physics at McLean High School in Northern Virginia, and Jennifer was what used to be his student. She's currently an undergraduate at the College of William and Mary. Dean created a unique living history program for his students, using period costumes, replicas of scientific devices, specimens, and demonstrations. He shows the ingenuity and imagination that were needed to tease out early glimmers of understanding before there was much prior knowledge and before there was really technology to help you very much. He also shows how the early enthusiasts of science, who were essentially all amateurs, inspired and corrected one another, and also how the public first learned of the new discoveries. Dean has expanded these presentations into a community service, where, as the natural philosopher, he recreates episodes of the history of science with performances at museums, schools, historic sites, and festivals. And he has a website that shows the diversity of the episodes he can present, and it's really a very fine website. Jennifer not only enjoyed and learned from Dean's presentations, but as a student at William and Mary, she lives in one of the best locations in the world for learning about the life and attitudes during the intellectual and political ferment in the late 1700s. As a student reenactor, she has performed at Mount Vernon, the Smithsonian Castle, the USA Science and Engineering Festival, and the Arlington Planetarium. Today, Dean and Jennifer will introduce us to William and Caroline Herschel, who made so many pivotal contributions to astronomy.
In relation to Vladimir Horowitz?
Guten Abend, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. There's a collection of natural philosophers who have dedicated themselves to the studies of the heavens, as both we have done. My name is Wilhem Herschel, and this is my sister, Carolina Lucretia Herschel. And we are here this evening to share some of our stories of our becoming of astronomers, and hopefully entertain questions that you may have at some particular point. Fortunately, my eyes have been damaged over years of watching, so I don't have to change spectacles.
You observing the sun or something?
Yes. Indeed, I have. I will be talking about my observations of the sun. They are quite interesting and rather controversial. So, again,
it's my great pleasure to make your acquaintance.
So, for those of you who are unaware, we are, and as you can hear, we have been so treated by our host to be able to hear some of our music playing in the background. It was music. So it was our passport from Hanover in Germany, where it's the homeland of King George III, who I'm sure you all respect rather greatly, being former subjects. Yes. That, we are now in his employ. And although we are known as being stargazers, we were originally musicians. I began my life as an oboist, and I served in the British Army during what was known as the 7 Years' War, which was fought primarily here in the Americas. And I was stationed in England, and I found it very nice to live there, and very profitable to be a musician. And in the early days, as I settled and became a professional musician, I invited my sister Caroline, who has the voice of an angel. I don't know if she'll be singing this evening, to join me and rescue her from a life of servitude, so to speak. And soon the Herschel name was known throughout England in the concert halls. But by the time we had find myself, well, before I go any further, I'm very happy to see that there are a great number of women in the congregation this evening, and as it should be, very pleasing for Caroline as well. So,
anybody who plays a double reed instrument deserves a lot of credit.
Well, thank you very much. I also played some pipe organ and a number of other instruments, but none are as nice as the natural gifts that my sister had. But since there are women in the audience, it is particularly appropriate that we are talking about a great female astronomer ourselves, and I believe there are female astronomers in our presence. So I think that it is all the more correct in this age of enlightenment that we should carry on the torch of the great philosophers of the past, even female ones, such as Hypatia of Alexandria. So we have here today several, as we can say, female natural philosophers, which are rare at our time, but hopefully in the future you'll be able to tell us that they are more common, and it looks as though that is the case now. So, again, this is my sister Caroline, and she too is a lady astronomer, which was very rare at the time.
Wilhem, my brother, by speaking too much of me, you do not speak enough of yourself. Remember, it was you who rescued me from a familiar life of servitude, not unlike the way Perseus rescued Andromeda. My brother rescued me to England, where he decided to train me as a singer.
And she was a magnificent singer, enchanting audiences far and wide, from the concert halls of Birmingham and Bath and Leeds. But by the late 1770s, I had found myself smitten by another muse. Not the one of music, but the muse of astronomy. So I found wonders in the skies as useful and enchanting as the musical notes that I could play, and soon our home in Bath became filled with globes and star charts and globes and mirrors and all sorts of things. The telescope was piled feet high, so we would have to push them away to conduct music tutoring lessons, because we did have to make money, because astronomy, I don't know if it has changed in your time, not particularly lucrative in and of itself. But with my sister's forbearance, I decided to train her because I needed an assistant.
Yes, every day he would leave me little envelopes inscribed with words, a little geometry for Lena, or a little algebra for Lena, and I would read these envelopes and learn. You may find this surprising, but I preferred these lessons to the entanglements of pomp and frivolity, and the social intrigues of Bath and London. I find most of the inhabitants of these social circles to be tedious and petty. Although I enjoyed the exciting world that music provided, I left my musical pretensions behind. You see, my dedication to my brother and our work trumped all such vanities. Wilhem would be the man who saw further into the universe than anyone before him, and I was honored to be his apprentice.
At last, she was far more than an apprentice, and what the world of music lost by her wonderful voice, the world of astronomy gained, and might I say, a bit of bias, that a gain in astronomy is something that is eternal. A note on the ear is ephemeral.
Those were exciting days. The home on King Street in Bath had become more like a factory. The piano was piled high with charts and globes and apparatus. The polishing of mirrors for telescopes went on endlessly. On many occasions I would feed Wilhem his soup through a window as he polished mirrors ceaselessly, or I would read to him to entertain him from our favorite books, Tristram Shandy or Don Quixote.
Oh, the mirrors. How we toiled on the mirrors. Here, I'm sure you all understand this, that we'd spend hours sitting, hand polishing metal discs, whereby we have to get, and perhaps this is still done today, as anyone still polish their own lenses and mirrors? That we would just sit and crank and crank and crank and crank, and it requires a very minute touch to get the correct curvature, as you all are familiar, to focus the telescope. And we got better and better at this as time went on, and the mirrors were essential because, as you know, if you wanted to do deep sky observations to see the things that I was hoping to see, you would need a very, very long refracting telescope. And the refracting telescopes of the late 1600s by the likes of Cassini and Hevelius in Danzig in Poland, to have a telescope that has resolving power to see features on the planets, they had to be many, many feet long. In fact, Hevelius had on the roof of his laboratory a telescope that was 110 feet long, held by scaffolds and cranes, and this was untenable. So the reasoning behind this had to be, here's a picture of
That's the Lord Ross telescope.
Hevelius' telescope, and you can see how long they are with the citizens below, and you can imagine the logistical difficulties of trying to aim such a telescope. So we all know this all changed thanks to Sir Isaac Newton, and he realized that the mirror at the bottom of the reflecting telescope was what would be the key to miniaturizing these beastly devices and making them much more attainable. And Isaac Newton claims when he built his telescope and referred it to the Royal Society to see if it was qualify him for membership, he said that his small tube, a matter of a foot in length, could have the resolving power of a telescope that was 6, 7, 8 feet in length, a refracting telescope. So it was a great advance. And if Isaac Newton did nothing other than this, I believe he would be famous for hundreds of years. But of course, he did a great deal more. So I decided, well, if Isaac Newton can see the moons of Jupiter with this very small telescope, I would make very large telescopes. And the quest began to make a telescope large enough to truly open the skies. And this was our first attempt at a 20-foot telescope. And as you can see, gentlemen will have to stand on a scaffold and watch and look down. And at the bottom, we had our mirrors. And eventually, we would plan to make a 40-foot telescope in the town of Slough near Windsor, but we'll get to that story later. So, as we, a fine example of how important the mirrors were, apart from Lena feeding me as I was polishing, because one would dare not stop once one had just the right field. There was a time when my brother and I were trying to cast the mirror for the very large telescope in our home in Bath. And it was essentially as a foundry would cast the shape of a bell or a cannon. We were pouring molten metal into a mold, and this mold broke. Pouring a volcanic torrent of copper and an iron alloy that was used for polishing onto the floor with such thermal force that it actually exploded the field stones of the floor. And I was lucky that our house was so well appointed in Bath that it had two entrances, one for my brother to escape and one for myself to escape for our lives.
The floor is still scarred and shattered, I dare say. But their tribulations were rewarded with the best mirrors and telescopes in the kingdom. Our tools of observation were peerless, matched only by our zeal to use them. Night after night, if the skies were clear and all other enterprise ceased in favor of stargazing, unlike tonight, in the heat of summer, when Wilhem had to keep mosquitoes at bay, I would rub raw onions on his head to keep the mosquitoes away, and on his clothes. And in the dead of winter, the inkwell would freeze and prevent me from logging his observations, so I would sit in a nearby window as Wilhem would ring a bell to signal for me to open it, and he would yell his observations, and I would write them down. Close the window. I even then began my own telescopic sweeps of the skies myself.
Yes, and soon the Herschels were known as for their impromptu stargazing parties in the streets of Bath on King Street, right outside of our home. We would invite people to come and observe the skies. And once we were famous in the concert halls, and now we were famous, the strange stargazers from Bath, who seemed to spend all of their money from singing and playing music on telescopes. It was in this situation where in 1781, in March 13th, I believe, when this paid off with great reward. This was the evening when I was conducting a sweep of the heavens, and our original work together was, I predominantly decided to study binary stars. Are these still studied today? It was my belief that studying binary stars would allow for a metric to measure distance, stellar distance, by trying to see if there was a parallax between binary stars. I did not have very much success with this, but I cataloged them nonetheless, because figuring there would be future generations who would put this information to use. At the same time, studying this, I also discovered the interesting aspects of nebulae, which part of my theory was that these cloudy, indiscrete disks were not, originally I thought that they were comets, but they seemed to be something more than this, something more distinctive. And it was my theory that eventually the Milky Way was, in itself, its own nebulae. And when I made a map of the heavens, according to the density of the way I saw the Milky Way, this was my guess as to what the Milky Way would look like if we were far away looking at it as a nebula. So perhaps there are astronomers on other worlds looking at the Milky Way and wondering if the nebulae are indeed conglomerations of stars. Or perhaps, and this was a very curious idea I had at the time, and was scoffed at by many of the people in the Royal Academy, was that these nebulae that looks merely like clouds could perhaps be stars that have yet unformed. But this was yet to be debated, and I was busy making my observations, as I was on the night of March 13th. And what I had seen as a comet originally perplexed me because it had a visible, although fuzzy and dim, it did have a disk, signifying that this could be a planet. So I waited several days to observe this to see if indeed it was moving as a planet should, and it did move ever so slightly, and it led me to think that this perhaps is a new planet, a new world. And it moved, of course, very slowly, slower than a comet would move, because the period of this new planet would have been 84 years. And although comets have very long periods as well, we all know the famous one described by Mr. Halley, that when they are closer and visible, they are moving quite quickly. So it was very easy to distinguish this planet from a comet. So with the approbation or the affirmation offered by my fellows in the Bath Astronomical Society, one must always have a discovery reviewed by peers, and I invited my friends, was a Mr. Watson from the Academy, and we decided that this was a new planet. This was eventually confirmed by the Royal Society. None other than Neville Maskelyne, who was the Royal Astronomer at the time, actually confirms this and hailed that this would be a brand new planet, and I was delighted, obviously. This planet actually doubles the size of the known solar system. And then there was the debate of what this planet would be called. Well, naturally our names had been in the paper as musicians in the past, but now they were everywhere. And it was interesting that in the newspapers throughout Europe, my name was called Herschel, Hermstel, Merschel, yes, all these different names. But eventually, it was determined by a friend of ours named Joseph Banks, who was a great naturalist who sailed with Captain Cook, yes, ring a bell? He was the greatest scientist at the time, because he had traveled all over the world. And he came up with this very interesting idea, because having a planet named Planet Herschel, which would be very exciting, does much for the ego, but it does not do much for the pocketbook. So it was Mr. Banks who recommended that this star should be named in honor of King George III, being from Hanover. There he is, our sovereign monarch. I believe they probably don't hold him in the same esteem that we hold him here. But the notion was that we would name the planet for King George. And there was a precedent for this. For those of you who know anything about Galileo, the moons of Jupiter are also known by the name
The Galilean satellites.
the Medicean stars, named for the Comte de Medici. And this seems to be a very good idea. So we decided that this planet would be named Georgium Sidus, George's star, for George William Frederick III, sovereign monarch of the Kingdom of Great Britain and the Prince Elector of the Royal House of Hanover. So perhaps you would like us to name it after George Washington, but it was a little bit dicey at the time. So we were a little bit sensitive about that in England.
With such support from an illustrious man as Joseph Banks, how could your plan fail? You see, he was the world's most famous scientist, apart from your Dr. Franklin, I suppose. Mr. Banks had circumnavigated the globe, as my brother said, and is now the president of the Royal Society. With the backing of Banks and the king, now somewhat obliged to reciprocate, George III appointed my brother as astronomer to the Royal House of Windsor. He was charged with educating the family and entertaining the kings as many guests, and I assisted, of course. At the time, it was my job to help educate the young princes and princesses about the stars, and I took a liking to them. One night, they were very adamant about seeing the skies, but it was very cloudy and rainy and hard to see, again, like today. And I couldn't tell these young kids that they would not see any stars, so my brother and I took some cardboard at the time and cut out some fake planets and shone a candle below them far away behind a fence and pretended that the children were seeing Saturn and they believed us. So
perhaps the next time you have a rainy evening and you're planning to use the observatory,
some cardboard.
this would work for the average person. So not only was Carolina my assistant in helping the royal family to entertain their guests with the telescopes there at the castle in Windsor, she and I were employed by the king. I received a salary, and I convinced His Royal Highness that my sister, being uncommonly skilled in the ways of astronomy, should also be salaried as such, and she became one of the first paid astronomers, I think perhaps the first paid astronomer.
The first female paid scientist.
Indeed, marvelous. So she would help me conduct regular sweeps of the heavens. She was looking for the binary stars, the nebulae, and believe it or not, on the 20-foot scaffold, you see how high this was, very easy and dangerous. So there were times when we were talking in town of a woman who was standing in petticoats and her frock at the top of a scaffold looking down the telescope helping observations. So you can imagine what a stir this caused. So, very, very impressive, would you not think?
You're making me blush.
Well, blush? My word, Lena, you should be beaming with pride. I admit that your work is noteworthy also to me and yourself, but also to your gender.
Well, there's one episode when I felt somewhat empowered, I might say. One night while I was hurriedly running to aid Wilhem, I impaled my leg on a large 6-inch hook that was used to raise and lower the chains on the telescope. I remember calling out, "I am hooked! I am hooked!" The doctor said a soldier with a similar wound would not be expected to recover for 6 weeks, and I recovered in only 2 weeks.
Impressive, but Lena, there are things more important than this. What's of the comets, yes? For those of you who are unaware, this is a comet hotter. And comet comes from the Greek verb for kometes, for hair, a star of his hair, yes? So as in the constellation Coma Berenices, yes? And the legend goes that Queen Berenice of ancient Egypt was so beautiful that she gave her hair to Aphrodite, and Aphrodite was so appreciative that she hung it in the skies for us all to see in the celestial firmament. So it is, I think, very appropriate that this mythology has a sort of feminine appeal, don't you think?
I suppose it is. It was August of 1786. Wilhem was away in Holland delivering a telescope, so I stayed home and diligently worked on my sweeps of the skies. And on August 1st, I discovered my first comet. I wrote immediately to Wilhem and Wilhem's colleagues to confirm, and one of his colleagues, Mr. Albert, wrote back to me saying that if this was indeed a comet, I would immortalize my name. I suppose it does, I am here. 5 days later, Joseph Banks came to our house to confirm that it was indeed a comet, and he congratulated me. And I can recall the excitement I felt on the evening collected upon the lawn with lots of gawkers and observers huddled around the telescopes to see it as well. The comet was small and had nothing grand or striking about it in particular, but it was the first ladies' comet, and I was delighted to humbly show it to others.
Why be humble? She went on to discover 7 more comets. So humility has no space in this room for people who appreciate your discoveries. You were recognized by the Royal Society. You won a gold medal from the Royal Astronomical Society. You had once been a star of the stage, and now you're a star of the celestial firmament. So it's my pride showing through as a big brother.
Yes, Wilhem, perhaps too much, but I can say the same thing about you.
Well, well, now you know something a little bit about us and our history. And it is my understanding that this convention of scientists, it is common to share some prepared words, a paper, or sharing of scientific ideas. So I have prepared for you this evening a talk in the spheres of the Royal Society, known as the immutable role of the imagination in astronomy. Now, I'm certain that in an assembly of astronomers, that our contributions are well known. But perhaps best well known is some of the controversial conjectures regarding the nature of my studies of the moon, the sun, and nebulae. Not unlike Giordano Bruno, his name perhaps is familiar.
Poor guy.
I have been
Poor guy.
similarly captivated by the wonders of the universe, and I have made suggestions that some would find rather fantastical. To my relief, in this age of reason, I did not meet the same fate as Mr. Bruno. But yes, he too assumed that the distant stars could perhaps be like our star. And if planets go around our star, perhaps planets go around their stars. And perhaps there are people at the same time on those planets looking at their stars the way we look at ours. So, for this, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in the Campo dei Fiori in Italy. So, luckily, we are in an age of reason. This will not happen. I think. Yeah, we have to check. I hear there's a gentleman running for the presidency of the United States. But anyway. So, I have indeed proposed that the neighboring planets may indeed be inhabited by sentient creatures, and the distant nebulae may actually be other Milky Ways, as I have mentioned. And I am not here to make apologies for engaging what might be seen as flights of fancy, for as I feel, the imagination is an indispensable catalyst for exploration. When Aristotle lived, the globe was largely unexplored. Yes, we understood the northern hemisphere, but the southern hemisphere was figured to be inhabited by the Antipodes, men who had feet for their heads. And this was the myth. This is what people believed until the age of exploration. These things were discovered to be false. And therein lies the essence of science. You can make a conjecture, but it has to stand to exploration and discovery and proof of this, whether or not it is true. So, even Galileo wondered when he discovered the moons of Jupiter, says, why would God make the moons of Jupiter? It's clearly not for us, because they've never been seen until now, so perhaps they are for the benefit of the citizens of Jupiter, so that they can look upon their moons the way we look at ours. So even the great Galileo was susceptible to such conjectures. So I hope that this is not a testament of the folly of imagination, but rather an example of the utility of scientific explorations. The wonder, yes, leads inevitably to the investigation and discovery of truth. Perhaps my ruminations of a race of what I call the lunarians, who lives in the craters. Those craters on the moon look rather constructed, so who knows?
Lunarians, not lunatics.
That's right, there we are. This is a word that was used to describe me when I proposed this theory. But perhaps these theories were ill-founded, or eventually by the time you have, in your times, we have found that men do not walk on the moon. Who knows? But you can fill us in at the end. Whimsy, I understand, is the desire, provides the desire to search. And the folly would be not in being whimsical in your conjecture, but in not following it to put it to the test, put it to the scientific principles described by Sir Francis Bacon. So, strange ideas and hunches have always been, especially in the sciences. Galileo was wrong about the tides. Isaac Newton provided the explanation. Johannes Kepler's laws of planetary motion, of which you are very familiar, were based on a phantasm of geometrical pentagons and the five perfect solids of Plato that were somehow assembled that would hold up the heavens. And this was found to be a fallacy. But these hypotheses, and others like them, were proven to be flawed through investigation, even though imagination conjures them up. So, imagination is the welcome foundation for subsequent scientific enterprise aimed at proving or disproving said conjectures. This is science's powerful role in progress, with a capital P. To explore and test hypotheses, and this Congress, I assume, can attest to this, is the legacy of science. The scientific community resides, in the scientific community, resides the mantles to which wonder is, through strict protocols, as I have mentioned, what we know as the scientific method, transformed into universal principles, such as the universal principle of gravitation. Consider Newton, the father of that immutable law of gravitation, and the laws of physics as well. Despite his greatness, Newton did not fully embrace the worth of the greater community of scientists. I did not meet this gentleman. Apparently he had very few friends. I think there were 3. He was known to have laughed only in public once, when he had an undergraduate saying, "Of what use is geometry?" Other than that, he seems to be a rather tedious man. But even he shrank from peer review, from critique of others. It was his book on optics that was written, that was criticized by the great Robert Hooke, Newton's nemesis, and Newton was so offended by this criticism that he said he would never publish again, and decided to just go back to his home in Woolsthorpe or his laboratory in Oxford and do his work by himself forever. And can you imagine if he had stayed a scientific hermit and we had never seen the work that he would produce? Had it not been for the work of the scientific community, specifically Edmund Halley, who we mentioned, Newton may never have penned the Principia, considered to be the greatest book of science ever written. In fact, since we are here in the Americas, we will speak of Mr. Jefferson, a native of Virginia, across the river. perhaps we should not speak of him being a Virginian, but nonetheless, if one has ever visited Mr. Jefferson's home, he has 3 pictures hanging in his foyer of the 3 greatest men who ever lived. John Locke, responsible for life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, pursuit of happiness. Francis Bacon, scientific method, and Sir Isaac Newton. So you can see the greatness of this gentleman came through across the oceans, and it almost didn't happen because Newton was alone, happy to do his calculations and literally shoves them onto the bed in a box until Edmund Halley came and asked him, can you help me understand the orbits of the comets? And this is what Newton did. And thus we have the greatest work of scientific enterprise of all time. So the collected insight at peer review that is offered by the greater community of natural philosophers can be a very powerful agent to the continuity of progress. Yes, it can be tinged with self-interest, of course, and personal conflict, debates between scientists who are rivals. Not everyone in the scientific community is a friend. But the cosmopolitan spirit of the age, the word that was coined by Dennis Diderot in his encyclopedia, that cosmopolitan didn't mean someone who lived in the city and had frivolities that offended Carolina so. They were people, the citizens of the cosmos, not be held to creed or borders that science should share. A great example of this was the collective endeavors to observe the transit of Venus, where countries from all over the world teamed together to make this great observation. So there can be self-interest. You can look for personal reward and pride, but it is incumbent upon men of science to welcome imagination, hypotheses, in order to investigate them fully with a certain sense of impartiality and without undue deference to authority, as we can all say, in the spirit of Galileo. This is the essence of great bodies like the Royal Society, and perhaps even this body of worthy astronomers. So yes, I stand by my musings that there are lunarians living in the circular indentations of the moon, and perhaps the spots on the surface of the sun that have been discovered by Galileo. It is my theory, this is not a popular one, that these are actually holes in the solar atmosphere. And perhaps we could, if we could see through them, we could see the people living on the surface of the sun as well. And just their atmosphere happens to be very luminous. So this is debated, but I hear no one has any other ideas yet. So perhaps you can enlighten me as to whether or not sunspots have been correctly identified. And obviously the notions that there are people living on other worlds, and that perhaps Andromeda is just like the Milky Way, and there is a meeting somewhere in Andromeda where they are doing the very same thing, talking about our galaxy. So, we only know with certainty when we look and explore, according to the precepts of what we call the scientific method, the primacy of discovery of spirit and spirited competition among men are scientifically important, and I must admit that being called the discoverer of a new world is something that is quite attractive and very sort of makes one feel good about themselves, and my sister can attest to this, having discovered 7 comets. I merely discovered 8 comets. See, as you can see, I discovered a few moons and a planet, so it's a little bit of sibling rivalry, perhaps.
Yes, 8 is greater than 3.
Yes, indeed, indeed it is. So, I encourage you, do not shy from being imaginative, do not cower from authoritative dogmas, and welcome the review of peers. And if one secretly yearns to make a discovery his or her very own, astronomy is a perfect quarry for such hunting. Because very few other scientists, let's take Lavoisier in his cozy, warm laboratory while he is doing chemical experiments, very few scientists are willing to sit out in the dark, in the cold, where you can freeze your inkwell, freeze your body, and sit patiently watching the skies and wait for the clouds to clear. So astronomy perhaps is a better opportunity for you to put your name in the heavens as well by making a great discovery of your own. So this patience will eventually pay off, I assure you. And thank you very much for your attention to my speech.
Lavoisier had a good reason for
My understanding is that, I don't know, Is anyone else coming up to give a scientific paper? Because we'd be happy to interested to hear this. Or are we the only booking this evening?
Who was the first American woman to discover a comet?
I believe there's a young lady named Maria Mitchell.
Mariah.
Mariah Mitchell,
Mariah
who
Mitchell,
is a rather
Very
accomplished
good.
astronomer.
Very
Yes,
good.
indeed. She was a contemporary of my son, John, who was a great astronomer in his own right. Yes.
Very good.
Why did William Herschel leave Germany to go to England? Why didn't he just stay in England?
Well, it was because Hanover was allied with England when the war broke out, and being a member of the military band. My father was a member of the military band, my brothers and I were both in the Marshall Band, and it was deployed to England during the war. Luckily, we weren't deployed all the way to the Americas, where the fighting was occurring. And essentially, when the peace was made, we decided to just stay behind. Yes?
Tell us how the name of that new planet, how did you determine what the name would finally be?
It was actually it was debated by a gentleman who's another scientist whose name is Bode, who actually said that we should probably name this planet according to the same basis according to antiquity, with mythological names, and that Jupiter, Saturn is beyond Jupiter. Saturn is the father of Jupiter, and Uranus is the father of Saturn, so it made perfect sense that this would be named Uranus. Also, in England, it was called Georgia Star for about 12 years. And you can still be found in certain almanacs, especially in Germany, where they were particularly proud that this planet is still called Planet Herschel from time to time. But we eventually conceded that this is probably the best thing, although it's rather nice to have your name next to the firmament.
So the IAU had nothing to do with it.
Yes, madam.
Not
Did you
yet.
observe at the prime focus, or did you have a Newtonian focus, or what?
Do I remember now? It's been so many years. Yes, we did have a Newtonian focuser. And it turns out that the 40-foot telescope that was eventually, this is what we lobbied the king for the money for. Once we established that we named the planet for him, we were allowed to ask for more money. So perhaps this is still done, so you ask for grants from the powers that be, and you continually run up to the ends of when these monies run out. And then I found that the very best thing to do is to say that we are so close to making something that we do not want to waste all of this work. So just a little bit more money. And I believe he gave us a grant of £2,000 and then another 1,000 on top of that. And this was constructed. But even with, and speaking of the focusing abilities, the great 40-foot telescope turned out, and I can admit this amongst fellow astronomers, turned out to be somewhat disappointing. It was very difficult. The mirror was so large and it needed to be polished so frequently that it was rather unwieldy, and as you can see, it was quite a behemoth in and of itself. Essentially, basically meant for just doing sweeps of the heavens, slowly and rotating through the heavens. And later, when I discovered the moons of several other moons of Saturn, we discovered them with a 20-foot telescope, and then we told the king that we discovered them with a 40-foot telescope, just so he was pleased.
What
Yes.
diameter mirror? What diameter mirror?
On the 40-foot scope was about 3 feet in diameter. This is what we were trying to pour when when the one exploded in the basement of our home in Bath. And it was rather difficult. I am led to understand by discussing with one of you earlier that there has been a way to apply silver to glass, and this process has been made much simpler, because our mirrors were solid metal alloys that needed to be specular glass or specular metal that had to be polished down, and getting just the right combination of alloys was very difficult. Although my telescopes were taken to the Royal Society, and that is what had me, the quality of that telescope and its mirror is what had me inducted into the Royal Society.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you would find an object? Like we have finder scopes in the software. With this telescope, I mean, it would be very hard to.
Basically, and you heard Carolina mention the word of just conducting sweeps, and you would essentially just start at the zenith, go down to the horizon, move it over, start at the zenith, go down to, or start at the horizon and go back, and slowly just do slices of the sky. So the very large telescopes were on turnstiles, so they could be moved so as to move to the left and to the right, as well as up and down. But they were not very nimble. For those, we had the smaller telescopes, and most of the discovery of the planet Uranus was made with my 6-foot reflector that was very easy to maneuver and adjust. This one tended to be, when people came to see it, they were more interested in walking inside the tube because it was so big, since they were with the observations that were made.
Another quick question.
Yes.
I don't want to consume too much, but did you have any interaction, either of you, with Michael Faraday?
Michael Faraday was a young man. When I was in my latter years, the Royal Institution was formed to compete with the Royal Society by a gentleman who was named Count Rumford, who was a very interesting character. He was a countryman of yours. He was born in Massachusetts, and when George Washington wouldn't give him a suitably interesting job in the military, he decided to go work for King George instead, and he spied on the Americans, sadly, and then went to England and became a scientist, and there he developed the Royal Institution. And young Michael Faraday was, I believe, the third director of experimentation at the Royal Institution, and they would have meetings such as this for the common folk to come see primarily experiments in chemistry and in pure physics. So the very first gentleman, I believe, was a man named, Thomas Young. Yes, who did studies in interference of light, absolutely. After that was Humphrey Davy, the great chemist, and then that was taken over by Michael Faraday. But my son and he were knew each other very well, but I did not. Although I did meet Count Rumford on a tour of France, and I was also delighted to be introduced by him to the great Emperor Napoleon as well. So, all for an accidental discovery. Yes, sir.
Did you also discover infrared light?
Indeed. I'm glad you raised this issue. We're speaking of my rather controversial discoveries, but yes, the discovery of infrared light, it was, perhaps the notions that whimsy, maybe there are different colors of light than are visible. So it was realizing by doing experiments to see how temperature and color were affected. It seemed as though certain colors would have cause higher temperatures or higher temperature increase. And just by happenstance, I moved the thermometer off the edge beyond where the red was and saw it increase rather greatly. And realizing that there was some sort of energy, eventually it was dubbed something known as a calorific ray. And this was adopted by Lavoisier, the chemist. At the time, he had a theory known as the caloric theory of physics, whereby heat was thought to be an invisible fluid. And this perhaps was this fluid transmitting through empty space, and it had yet to be figured out. But this form of light was curious at the time, but perhaps it was just a discovery, and it was shared with the Royal Society, and who knows if it became of interest later on. Has it become of interest later on?
Yes.
Very good then. Well, you're welcome.
Very much.
Yes, sir.
I'm curious about the observing. What was the field of view of the telescope? And did you be able to watch things, before the Earth's rotation took the object through the field of view, were you able to actually spot anything or examine anything?
Well, and this is the reason why we had to have this system where if I had watched and taken my eyes away to watch and write down the location of the object, the star, it was gone. The field of view was relatively small, and therefore Carolina had to sit within earshot so I can yell out to her when I observed something, made the measurement, so to allow for that quickness, because it would remove from the field of view very quickly. and especially with the larger telescopes, which were not nimble enough to adjust to find. If I had my small telescope, I could adjust it very easily to follow the moon throughout the evening. But the field of view of the great telescopes was rather small, and all the more reason to have an assistant nearby to write things down immediately, because they would remove themselves from view very quickly.
And how did your operation compare with, how did Hevelius do it, who seemed to also have some extremely long telescopes?
Hevelius, I think the notion was, I did not meet the man personally, but it seems to be like it was just the notion of having the biggest telescope seemed to be more important than the utility of it. So when they were displayed in Danzig, as you can see from the pictures that I held up, people came around to see the monstrosity of it all, but they were grievously impractical. Obviously things such as chromatic aberration, and the reason why they had to make them so long was because of the chromatic aberration that actually diminished it somewhat. But the field of view and the ability to move it was nearly impossible. So it could be used to look at stationary objects. You can probably see them moving very well. I don't know if they were used to observe the sun with filters, to sunspots the way Scheiner did in Germany, but it was very unwieldy, and this is the reason why I presume that Newton's discovery was so seminal in that regard. So perhaps you can inform me on, are there men on the moon? I've been waiting very long to find this.
Only briefly.
I will take that because of my critics on Fleet Street, who were more than happy to make cartoon images to make fun of men of science. Perhaps this is done today, it's men of science.
Yeah.
By the small minds tend to make fun of those who have. Here's a gentleman who is looking for his comet, and he is so absorbed in looking for his comet that he's not realizing that this gentleman is making time with his lady. That's rather disappointing. And here's a picture of a lady astronomer, because Caroline's, what I believe, illustrious position as the first female astronomer was actually made fun of by some of the papers in London. And here is a lady who is observing through her telescope at what she thinks is a comet that emits, how should I say, a strong sulfurous smell is emitting from her comet. And as you can see, there's a rather indecorous picture of an angel passing gas towards the Earth. So these sorts of things are something that we've had to deal with very commonly. I presume they're still here today. But when it was mentioned that people found out that I thought that men could possibly live on the moon, I didn't say that they did. I will be happy now to take this information that apparently, for a very short time, there have been some tests. Exactly how many do we know? 1 or 2, 3, 4?
20?
Is that marvelous. I consider this
Dozen.
affirmation.
Even dozen.
We found out that infrared is being used. We found that men have walked on the moon. We found out that perhaps nebula are indeed other galaxies.
Yes.
Yeah, I was right on that
Some
account.
nebulas.
Some of them. And I'm particularly interested in the notion of the ones that just appear to be gas clouds. Were they indeed, as I suspected, places where stars yet have not yet formed?
Some are.
Aye, this is not. By whatever means we have transmitted ourselves into time, into the future, I hope we can transmit ourselves back so that we can go around and correct the scoffers. Yes, indeed. So, any further questions? I don't know how long the evening goes.
It's interesting that a similar telescope to that is still the official insignia of the Royal Astronomical Society. This is Lord Ross's telescope.
Indeed,
Very
absolutely.
similar.
Roy Ross copied his based on the telescopes that we built, and there was also another one that it was made for that I had made for the King of Spain, that is still resides, I believe, in Madrid, of the same structure. So it became quite in vogue, and it's always happy when scientific and fashion crisscross, so that the people who fancy themselves as being erudite by being around scientists, imagine that. So if we can only have this happen more often. So
Were there any indications that there was another planet out there is it eventually Neptune?
well, going ahead in time, so my son's time, since we are temporarily unfixed apparently this evening, I can say that suspicions that there could be something beyond that. Remember, Uranus was discovered simply by happenstance. I was looking through the sky and found a white anomaly, the way Carolina found her comets. But the notion of a planet beyond that was insulated in the 1820s and the 1830s by a gentleman named Leverrier, based on the work of Laplace and Lagrange, who realized that figuring out that the slight slowdowns in the motions of the outer planets, including Uranus, could possibly be explained by something beyond them, pulling and slowing them down, but the mathematical calculations were grievously difficult. And even though this was predicted in the 1790s, it was not firmly discovered until the 1840s, when they started looking for the planet, which would eventually become the planet Neptune, which was discovered in 1940-something. I do not have to know dates beyond my life. Yes, sir.
Didn't your son eventually go to South Africa to do observations?
Absolutely, yes. He was very, he admires the fact that early in his career, Edmund Halley went to the southern hemisphere on the island of St. Helena, where Napoleon was eventually banished, to do observations of the southern skies. And it was my son who was captivated by this notion of skies yet uncharted. That he went to the southern climes to observe the skies there. And as we were talking over dinner, that those of you who are wise in the ways of astronomy, the names of all of the constellations in the southern hemisphere have what we call rather modern names, as opposed to those of Perseus and Cetus and the likes, and Andromeda. Yes, so yes, indeed, my son was very active.
Yes, in fact, it's my understanding that the Baltimore Sun had a series of scurrilous articles about men on the moon that was, and that they were Baptist ministers that wanted to evangelize them. And they wrote to your son, and then the whole thing was found out to be a fraud. And the person that perpetrated the fraud was a journalist in the Baltimore Sun. What was his name? He was a poet? No. Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was a journalist. He propagated the thing that your son proved was false.
Well,
They should have sent the Baptist minister
perhaps
anyway.
it was the best that you won at Yorktown, because we would not want to have sort of scurrilous Americans doing all of this in our native home. It sounds like things are quite scandalous and controversial. Perhaps this continues to your day as well, especially in the news.
Yes.
Well, if there are no other further questions, we invite you to come up and ask particular questions if you so like. But we are very happy. Caroline, stand up and take a
Thank you very much.
I don't mean to adjourn your meeting prematurely, as they say, as business to be closed.
Do we have any additional business aside from thanking our presenters? Yeah, thank you very much.